Fearon here, continuing to talk with my friend. She has said that she has a tendency to prefer a katana, but that she still likes the idea of dual wield. So I thought I would do a video specifically talking about Miyamoto Musashi, who I spoke about in my previous dual wielding video directed towards her. And for that I brought in my father's bokken here. This is Cold Steel's training bokken made of polypropylene. It's really tough, very flexible. It is a lot lighter than a real katana would be. I think this thing is like only about a pound and something. Actually, no. Sorry, this is not Cold Steel's. I apologize for that. This is a nameless company found on Cult of Athena. I have no idea who they are. All I know is that there is a symbol here that is on all of their swords. Let me see if I can get it. There you go. I have no idea if that's upside down or sideways or what. But it's on all their swords. It also made this one, which I'll be using to replicate a kodachi or wakizashi, which I know this is quite a bit longer than a real one. This is in fact based off of a Chinese war sword. I believe it's called a dao. It's also, they are polypropylene. I was correct about that. But this is extremely top-end heavy. In fact, I may break the eskrima stick back out to do this, but it just kind of works a little bit better for me because it gives me a better idea of, it's got a handle shape, it has a blade shape, so it gives me a better idea of, how to move a sword around rather than just a stick. But to start off with the katana, there's a few things you have to understand. I'm going to do this video about Musashi. Musashi was a rebel. There's no other word for it. He broke all the rules of his day. Kenjutsu, even at that time, was extremely ritualized. It was extremely stiff. I mean, there were a lot of schools that taught different variations and styles, but they all focused on a few simple things. Number one, katana is a two-handed sword. It has to be used with two hands. And there were a lot of rules. Basically, they almost deified the sword. No grabbing the blade, no throwing your sword, so on and so forth. No hitting with the guard or the pommel. And again, it has to be used with two hands. No using it one-handed outside of certain preset scenarios. The first such scenario is, of course, aero, the quick draw cut. Like that. Now, and this is where you're going to be seeing very well the fact that I initially studied Kenjutsu for quite a few years before I switched over to Hima. And aero was, in fact, one of the things that I learned the most. But outside of that, in general, they taught the use of the sword in two hands as a cutting implement. There is some techniques for thrusting with the katana, but they're very rare, and it's basically just that general concept like that. Whereas with a European sword, you've got all kinds of thrusts from upper guards and from lower guards and things like this. And you get a lot of using sword one-handed. But you don't see that sort of thing a lot in Kenjutsu, now or then, simply because it went against the rules. Basically, you've got to understand a little bit of the background. During the warring period, the samurai, the way of the samurai, was the way of the horse and the bow. The weapons of the samurai in war were basically the horse, which only he was allowed to ride, much like a European knight was only allowed to ride one of the big war horses. And it was the Yumi bow, which he would loose from off of the horse. And to a lesser extent, the naginata, which could be used from horseback, although mostly polearms were considered a foot soldier's weapon. And a sword was basically just a status symbol. It was there to show, I'm a samurai. Specifically, not just one sword, but the dual set of swords. But you had the katana, which was basically like your outside street sword. And then you had the kodachi in the early days, which was actually extremely short. And then the wakizashi, which was a little bit longer during the later period. I think by Musashi's time, I have heard some people in movies and such about Musashi refer to the short sword as a kodachi, but I think by that time mostly it was the wakizashi was what was used. And it was the sword when you entered a daimyo's household or any kind of household, it was considered polite to remove your long sword and put it on a rack so that you were left with just the short sword, which was what you would use to defend yourself indoors. Now, largely the wakizashi was made with a very short handle. You could really only use it one-handed, maybe two-handed if you were willing to grab hold of the pommel, which a lot of them would teach holding on to the pommel. But there were still techniques with the wakizashi that revolved around using it one-handed. And in fact, police in Japan carried what was called a jit, which is basically a baton with a little, basically it's a quillon. It's a hook-shaped quillon on one side that they would use in the left hand and the wakizashi in the right. This was the doshin, the police force under the Tokugawa regime. And they would use the jit to parry. Just like a European during the same time period basically would have used a mangosh, a left-hand dagger, as a parrying weapon. And they would parry with it and strike with the wakizashi, much as I've talked about. And if I can remember properly, Musashi's father was a well-known swordsman, but he also practiced, to a certain extent, the jit. That's important to note. Now, Musashi's father, from all accounts, was a bit of a fucking asshole. Pardon my French, but he was an extreme traditionalist, extreme close-minded asshole. There are even accounts of Musashi having been a bastard son, of some, peasant or whatever that his mother had screwed around with, and so on and so forth. And when Musashi's father taught him, but he was apparently rather brutal in his teaching. He would beat Musashi if Musashi didn't do properly, which, to be honest, from what I've read, that's not too different from the average father in Japan at the time, or in Europe for that matter. They could often be quite cruel when it came to teaching their children martial arts because they didn't think it was doing them a favor to not be. But at the same time, he apparently took it too far to a certain extent. Now, Musashi was just a boy. He was 12 or 13. He only knew the basic 8 cuts, which are basically the crosswind cuts, like this, the diagonal cuts, like this, uppercuts, the head cut, and the thrust. Well, a stranger comes to town, a noted duelist, a noted swordsman, a badass. I can't remember his name now, but he comes to town and he puts up a sign and he's challenging anyone who wishes to fight him to a duel. And this guy's a very good swordsman. And he kills several local samurai who attempt to duel him. And then along comes Musashi. And the problem is Musashi is not trusted with a sword yet. Now there are varying accounts. Some state that he was using a bokken. Others that all he had on him was a bow staff. This is my axe haft. I took the blade off for now because it was loose and all that. But either way, it was just a wooden stick. Now you gotta remember, Musashi is 13. He's received minimal training. He's never been in a duel in his life. This other man is a respected samurai. He's 20 some odd years old. At the very least, he's 10 years older than Musashi. If I remember right, he was actually closer to like 12 or 13 years older. He'd received very good training from a well-respected school. He'd been in a lot of duels before, but here's the point. Just like in Europe, a duel had rules, and that's where I was leading up to with this. During the Civil Warring period, this was not considered a weapon really by the samurai. It was considered a status symbol. After the Warring period, it suddenly became a weapon. You would use it in fights. But after the warring period, you're not at war with anyone. So you're not using this to fight in war where there are no rules beyond, the basics of, this and that, where a fight is won by whatever works. This was used to fight in duels. It was a duelist's weapon. In fact, some translations of Japanese texts and such talking about the swordsmen of that day called them duelists. And a duel has something very specific about it. It has rules. A lot of rules. Don't grab blades. Some of them would be don't grapple. Don't grab your blade. Don't grab your opponent's blade. Don't grapple with them. Don't throw your weapon. So on and so forth. So it was extremely ritualized and dance-like, which you see in a lot of films and such. This very dance-like movement out of them. So on and so forth. But Musashi had never been in a duel in his life, and he'd only received minimal training from a person who was rather cruel and, well, abusive, to not use the term lightly. And he had a weapon that isn't exactly a sword. If you go with the idea that he was using a staff, which he could have used a bokken as well, but I like the idea of the staff better. It seems to fit a little bit better with how this went down. But apparently this guy was a bit of a bully. And probably in his own way, he reminded Musashi of his father. He was a traditionalist samurai who was a bully about it. And he was bullying the locals, and Musashi challenged him. Either that, or who knows, it may have been, his father didn't love him enough, didn't think he was worth anything with any weapon, didn't think he could win, didn't think he could do anything. So it spurred him, and he challenged the man to a duel. And Musashi, the only way you can really say it, from modern standpoints, Musashi went into a moment of basically psychotic rage when he faced off with the man. Apparently, there are varying different stories, but the man did fight him, and at first he was winning. And in fact, technically, some stories even claim that he actually won the duel. When Musashi was being forced to fight by the rules of the duel, he won. But either way, whether he was winning or whether he had already been declared the victor, Musashi went into a rage. And in a rage, he ignored all concepts of rules. He had been trained so hard and so vigorously in those same 8 cuts that he knew them. But in the midst of his rage, his body's muscle memory knew how to do those movements, but his rage also drove him to do things that were against the rules, to do things instinctively, without thought. And so instead of being dance-like and ritualized like a duel, he literally just walked in and beat the man's guard aside and took him to the ground, possibly with grappling. Put him on the ground one way or the other. Some states that he actually hit the man upside the head so hard that it practically broke his face in one hit and put him on the ground. And all the reports state that he was fast, frighteningly fast. But the biggest point is, and the reason why we can say he flew into a rage is because he didn't stop there. He didn't stop after putting the man on the ground. And he used no technique with it at all. He basically just walked up to the man and started beating him to death. He beat him to death. He beat his skull into a pulp on the floor. And then stood over him and challenged anyone else who wanted to fight him. 13 years of age, he killed his first man. And he did it by breaking the rules. He did it using a weapon that was considered a peasant's weapon. Whether it was a bokken or whether it was a staff, he used something that was not a blade. It was considered amazingly dishonorable in the first place for him to want to fight a samurai without a sword, and then to beat him, and the way he beat him was despicable. Well, after this, whatever happened, whether it was his father being abusive or whether it was people coming at him for the duel, he was forced to run away. 16 years of age, he fled. And apparently, he either had a sword when he fled or he got one shortly after, because he did have a sword, but he disappeared for several years into the wilderness. And later he stated that he was learning his art. He was training himself with his weapons. The next time he appears, it is in Edo, in Japan. Modern day, was it Edo or was it Kyoto? I think it was Kyoto, now that I think about it. No, sorry. The next time he appears is at the Battle of Sekigahara, between Tokugawa Ieyasu and... damn it, I can't remember the other guy's name now. He was the loser, needless to say. Tokugawa won and became shogun. Well, Musashi fought on the other side. He fought for the enemy. Well, on the battlefield, he fought several duels before the battle started, and people were kind of amazed at how quickly and easily he moved with the weapons, how fast he was, and the fact that he won. But then, during the battle, that, I believe, is It was the big changing point for him. He saw battle firsthand rather than a duel. He saw mass death, and he saw the samurai way of life. He saw Bushido at its finest. Hundreds of men armed with nothing but swords running like idiots into the face of massed musket fire on both sides, all for the sake of another man's honor. It wasn't even, it was, they told themselves it was for their own honor, that their own honor would be soiled if they didn't fight for this other man's honor. But in the end, it was the other man's grievance they were fighting for, not their own. And this goes on to color Musashi's outlook. Later he speaks, he fought in that battle, and I want to say he fought in one other in his life. But later on he spoke of the fact that he would never willingly fight in a battle again in his life. It was the most despicable thing he had ever witnessed in his life. People throwing their lives away for nothing. Another thing that he looked down upon was the act of seppuku. All of his life, in his writings, he stated it was despicable and should be thrown away with the garbage. You were killing yourself. For what? To make another man happy? Because you think that's the best thing to do with your life, is to throw it away? However, he also states, I can't remember his exact words now, but basically it amounted to try to change the world's mind makes you a fool. One man cannot change the mind of the entire world, unfortunately. This seems to speak, especially because at the start of the same book, he says something that's almost counterintuitive to that. Except it's not, in a way. Basically, at the start of the book, he says, do not blindly follow the ways of the world. But at the end of the book, he states, to try to change the rule, to try to change the world by yourself is foolishness. It's fault. Basically, what he's saying is, you should not blindly follow the ways of the world, but to try to change it is idiotic. You shouldn't do that either, because you're wasting your time. Basically, what he showed is the fact that he believed in something that in Japan at that time, and even now to a large extent, is almost considered taboo. He believed in free will. He believed in the idea of a person living their lives for themselves rather than for someone else. He believed in, if you took your own life, you did it for your own reasons. And even then, he considered that to be something that you shouldn't do. That, it was literally a despicable idea to him. You've been given this life to live, and you're going to take it away. You're going to take it on another man's orders. Because as far as he's concerned, you shamed yourself. And even more despicable are the ones who do it willingly without even being told to, because they think it's the right thing, because they think they deserve to die because of dishonoring someone else. Well, but anyway, so after the Battle of Sekigahara, he disappears again for a little while. But then he winds up in Kyoto. It's the next place that he's seen. And to give you another idea, this is how much against the Bushido and the way of the samurai he was. Musashi, most samurai would die rather than become ronin, masterless. Musashi lived his entire life as a ronin. He refused to have a master. After the Battle of Sekigahara, that was the first and last time that he actually took me as a samurai and gave an oath and had a master. He was actually samurai. The rest of his time, he was ronin. He was vagabond. And most of the time, he was a rather dirty son of a bitch. Your typical samurai was extremely vain, very clean, usually had the top knot where the crown of their head is shaved and just this one piece of hair is folded up over the top of their head into a top knot. His hair he wore it ridiculously long. It was usually uncombed. He had a scraggly beard. And to make matters worse, he had been apparently afflicted with pox as a child. So he had horrible scars, either that or very bad acne. And he had horrible scars all over his face. And he was tall. I mean, this is a Japanese guy. He was probably close to 6 feet or a little less. He was considered to be a giant by his own people. Very tall, but gangly looking. He wasn't very bulky for his size. He was very gangly, slender. And his eyes were, he did a self-portrait once. Very, from all accounts, very accurately. You know, it's not flattering in the least. He's not a very handsome guy. And the first thing you notice is that his eyes are really round and bulgy. You know, they just kind of seem to stick out of his head like a frog's eyes or something almost. He's definitely not a very pretty or handsome man, to say the least. And then add on to this fact, he wore peasant clothing, simple peasant's clothing, usually patched, tattered, dirty. He was dirty. He wouldn't bathe but maybe once a month or so. And it was all for a purpose, though. He didn't do it because he was a lazy bum. He did it for a reason. He did it to be insulting. And it worked. So the next time he's seen in Kyoto, where he goes to, what is the name of the school? The Yoshioka School. Yoshioka School was run by two brothers, technically. They were the Yoshioka brothers. And wait a minute. Alright, I've got to make this quick. So I might just end this video with the Yoshioka School. So he goes to Kyoto, and he challenges the Yoshioka School, the Yoshioka brothers, the oldest brother, to a duel. And after a lot of finagling around and so on and so forth, he meets the brother in a duel. And he sets the time for the duel, even. He tells the brother, or the brother tells him what time he will meet him and where. So the brother comes out, goes to the place, you know, in all of his ceremony and all of his garb. He goes to the place and arrives and stands around, waiting, you know, it's a very hot summer day, and he's waiting in his garb, all this fancy ceremonial garb that he feels he needs to wear to look perfect for a duel. By all accounts, he was a very vain individual, very vain. Very fancy in his dress and manners and attitude. And an hour passes. Musashi's not there. It's an hour after the duel was scheduled. Musashi's not there. And then it's 2 hours and his fancy clothing is soaked in sweat. And then it's 3 hours and it's getting dark. And finally everyone, this huge crowd that's gathered, decides to leave. They're starting to leave. You know. But if he leaves, he'll be seen as a coward. But finally, you know, even his advisors are telling him, the man's not going to arrive, he's a coward, let's go. And they're just getting set to do so when suddenly, out of the crowd, walks this bum with his hair pulled up into a simple knot on the back of his head and a lot of it hanging loose into his face, wearing raggedy clothes, a scraggly beard on his face, dirty, stinking, with a sword, not a single one, he didn't have a wakizashi, but a sword on his side. And it's Musashi, and he's here for the duel. So, of course, this has the obvious effect. The other guy, the Yoshioka brother, is pissed, horribly so. He's in a screaming mad dog rage at this point, like, you know. And so he steps up, and the Yoshioka school was well known for Aikido. And so he steps up with his sword still in his scabbard, threatening Musashi. And one of the books I've read, it's a novel, but I thought it was cool. If I'm not mistaken, it is actually a transcript of what, at least what a legend says what was actually said. And the man said, "You're late." And Musashi simply replied, "You set the time, not me." Or something similar to that. And so he stands here, and he just stands there, you know. I'm here, let's get this done. But he's not taking a stance, he doesn't have his hand on his sword or anything, he's just standing there. And the other guy finally just gets pissed off and does the quick draw on him. And this is actually, I've seen this in a documentary before, and it's also how it was described in the book. This is actually what happened. Musashi just steps back because he tricked the guy. The guy was so pissed off, Musashi tricked the guy. He led the conversation that they had around, the argument that they had around, until he had the guy so hot under the collar and so pissed off that he threw down a challenge to him, daring him to saying that he could beat him in one cut. And the guy accepted the challenge. In other words, they could each only have one cut, one strike to kill the other. And if their strike missed, they had to stand aside and let the other man throw his strike. So when this guy threw his cut, Musashi just stepped back out of the way and let the cut miss. And leaving the other guy standing there, and knowing that he was a good honorable samurai, and knowing that the other guy would feel honor bound to let Musashi make his cut. And so Musashi made his cut and didn't kill him. Instead, when he made his cut, he simply pulled the sword out and slashed, and he cut the guy right across the chest, right across the pectoral muscles, deep enough to completely slash the muscles open all the way to the bone. In other words, he's not going to ever be able to lift his arms over his shoulders again. He will never use a sword again in his life. Well, great dishonor. Great shame. The younger brother challenges Musashi to a duel. This time, Musashi arrives early. 3 hours early. He's standing there waiting on them when they arrive. The other brother goes to make his move. And this time, I've never actually read an exact account of how this fight went down exactly. If I can remember right, Musashi let the other one make a cut, and as he was coming with the cut, he simply stepped around behind him, maybe even used a shove to get him to turn his back, and then cut him across the back and actually kill him. Musashi doesn't use too much of his dual wield at this time, leading a lot of people to speculate he hadn't yet really come up with it at that point. But he was working on it. Because after this, he killed that brother. But after this, the entire school's been dishonored. So they set up a challenge to Musashi. There's one last brother left who's a little kid. And stories state that he killed the kid as well. Although it's never actually been proven if he's the one who killed him, or if the kid killed himself, or one of the elders at the school killed him to preserve honor or something of that sort. But they set him up, though. It wasn't a duel. When he arrived, it was at an old abandoned temple, the ruins of an old temple outside of town, the Ichijo Temple. The Ichijo Temple, I believe was what it was called. And the whole school ambushed him. There were like 20 or 30 guys in the woods. And they all ambush him. But here's where Musashi does two things. When he's talking about it, he talks about the fact that in an actual fight, and this is proven by modern-day self-defense instructors, if you're in a fight against a lot of numbers like that, there's actually only 4 or 5 of them will have the ability to come at you at any one time. Musashi talks about this in his book of 5 Rings. He talks about the fact that when you are outnumbered that big, it's not as bad as you think, because only 4 or 5 can come at you at one time. And the trick is to keep moving. And here's where he finally unveils Niten Ichi Ryu, or two heavens, what was it called? Two heavens, basically translated to two swords, two sword style. Short sword in the left hand, long sword in the right. And he uses these two swords to be able to defend to one side and strike to the other, or strike to one side and then strike to another, and keep space all around him as he's moving. He keeps moving constantly. And there is actually some support to the fact that he didn't always use both swords, only when he was up against a group. However, he did get very fond of using the long sword just in one hand. He talks heavily about the fact that the long sword should be used in one hand, not two. Because leaving one hand empty gives you space. It gives you the ability to use this hand for other things, to grapple with, to push, to open a door, to pull your other sword if need be. For instance, and he winds up killing 9 of them, I think. He only gets injured once himself. Supposedly, a man with a bow shot him in the shoulder with an arrow. That's the only injury he received that day against all these opponents. And he killed 9 of them so quickly that it scared the hell out of them, and the rest of them all ran. Some accounts state that he killed the 9 approaching the boy, who was the last member of the Yoshoka bloodline and killed him. And when he killed him, it was like cutting the head off the snake, and all the others fled. Of course, most of the modernizations and the stories and stuff always want to show him slaughtering the entire school, like 70 guys in one fight, because that's impressive. But real historians will tell you it didn't happen that way. Even the original accounts state he only maybe killed 9 or 10 guys and wounded a few others, and then they all ran off. But that is the first part of this. I'm probably going to make this a series talking about Musashi, but that was the first part. Let me know what you thought, and please, I would say like and subscribe, but that's kind of cliche, and it's obvious. I wouldn't be putting this up here if I didn't want somebody to be watching it. I mean, I love doing these videos, but at the same time, if nobody's watching them, it's kind of like talking to thin air. But I hope you enjoy it. So, see you all in the next